Hi all, thank you for joining the session Versus Your Governance, Why Not Both? My name is Fatih Degirmenci. I work for Ericsson as a developer. I also co-chair Special Interest Group Interoperability within Conditional Foundation. During this session, I will talk about what governance is, how it can be applied in software development projects, how the velocity can be achieved while applying governance, and how policy-driven continuous delivery could help achieving governance without sacrificing the velocity. Let's start with the definition of governance. If you open Cambridge Dictionary and type in governance, you will see the definition of governance as the way that organizations or countries are managed at the highest level and the systems for doing this. So if you look at governance in software development, it is not entirely different from how governance is defined in the dictionary. Governance is one of the key mechanisms in organizations to ensure that the software development projects align various aspects. And what those aspects are, one of them is security, the other one is laws and regulations, and finally business. So the software development projects, the organizations working with software development projects need to align with these aspects to ensure they don't exploit end user security risks. They follow local or global laws and regulations, which could be industry specific or generic, and finally to satisfy business requirements. To make this a bit more relevant to our day-to-day lives, if you think about the latest technologies and methodologies that have been developed within communities or within various industries, you'll notice that these new technologies and methodologies delivering tremendous advances in various industries and increasing the pace of innovation. So we are getting new services, new features all the time, much faster than before. And one of the key aspects of this is the speed. However, we must make sure whatever we push to production adhere to security and laws and regulations while satisfying business requirements. What does this mean? So if we think finance industry, I'm sure most of you have applications installed on your smartphones doing financial transactions, and you have accounts on certain apps, but you don't have to visit a bank office or talk to clerk in the office. You just install the application, create an account, submit your photographic ID, and then you got your account set up in a few minutes. Then you were able to transfer or receive money without any issues. And obviously, this is very simple comparing to how the things were before. But since everything is done over software and you simply pass your personal details to someone else with your money, you want to make sure that your details and your money are safe and it is not stolen by some hacker somewhere else. So the organization providing you this type of financial service or applications must make sure that they adhere to certain security rules, laws, regulations aspects. The next example is healthcare. As you know, most of the healthcare institutions are doing their transactions online, and it is critical that the healthcare information private to individuals are not exposed and not accessed by unauthorized people. It is critical that these health institutions adhere to security rules and regulations similar to finance institutions, maybe even more strictly. And finally, telecom. And for example, you are having an emergency and you need to call 112 or 911. You want that call to go to the emergency service. You don't want that call to drop. You don't want to get busy tone. You just want that call to happen. And certain rules and regulations ensure that this always happens. And the common theme across all these different industries, and perhaps even more, is that yes, we can bring new services, new features, hence to our users much faster than before, but this doesn't mean we can neglect security rules, laws, and regulations while keeping business aspects in mind. Some might say governance slows things down as well, because the focus lately is on the pace and speed and pushing new things out to hands of our users much faster than before. And governance may look like it is slowing things down. And it's not necessarily like that, but some of you may think that, or may work in organizations that some or all of the checks are done manually and compliance is checked by humans. And if this is the case, this obviously slows things down, because you finish your coding, you build your container image, everything is ready to be pushed to production. But if you need to get a human to review what you have done, things may be slower than how it could be if automation was in place. So there are ways to address this, which is one of the topics of this talk. So now we can look at velocity. We already talked about velocity in software development, but look at velocity from Cambridge Dictionary. Velocity is the speed at which an object is traveling, which is obvious. But if we look at velocity in software development, it is not very different from what is described in the dictionary. Velocity is about how quick a new feature and/or bug fix reaches to the production, to the hands of end users. And this depends on the pace of innovation. And thanks to the innovation, we can create new functionality to hand into our users with the quality built in. And obviously, some of these things may look like they could slow things down. For example, you innovate new feature, you get that into production, but in order for that thing to get into production, you have to ensure that it must pass certain quality checks. But again, this is at the same time an enabler, such as quality checks. If you send a problematic code to production as fast as possible without ensuring the quality is in place, then this may actually slow things down when you catch those issues in production. So it's kind of velocity depends on quality as well. So we talked about the organization, the business, the governance, rules, laws, regulations, and new features, and so on. But what about developers? Because most of the times when we talk about the speed and velocity and governance, developers are generally not one of the highest priorities. But I believe developers must be one of the top priorities for any organization which is doing software business, because developer experience, productivity, and happiness are key for innovation and speed. As a developer, if I have to fill in some spreadsheet for marking some compliance issues as done, then it obviously take away the fun from my job, and it may hit my happiness, and it may reduce my productivity, and it may make my experience worse than how it was before. So we must make sure that we put enough focus on developer experience, productivity, and happiness to ensure innovation and speed. So if we put all these things together, and we talked about all these things: laws, regulations, security, and business. So these are on one hand, functionality, quality, and innovation is on the other hand, and we have developer experience, developer happiness, and developer productivity. How these things could go hand in hand together without forgetting one or without prioritizing one or the other. Obviously, we may have times we need to prioritize certain things over others, but there must be a balance that all these things get needed attention at all times. And in this case, policies could be helpful, because policies are principles to guide our decisions. If you open Wikipedia and if you type in policy, you will get this definition. Policy is a deliberate system of principles to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes adopted by governance body within an organization. So policies are essentially the things the governance body uses to achieve desired and rational outcomes. And this brings us back to what policies are again. Policies are business decisions. They are clearly defined, documented, and governed. Another property of policies is they must be enforceable, measurable, and auditable. Like if you create set of policies, but if you can't enforce them, then there is no point having those policies, because over time people will stop taking care of them and they will start neglecting those policies. So you have to be able to enforce those policies. In addition to be able to enforce those policies, you must be able to measure the outcomes of those policy enforcement. Like, do you achieve the desired outcomes? And you can only do that by measuring things. And finally, you must be able to audit your policies. Like, do we have the right policies in place, or do we have the authenticity of those policies, who created those policies, and how those policies are maintained? And with type of policies, the developers can apply this type of approach to ensure that they can prevent defects, they can build security into application rather than having that as an afterthought. They can ensure no trade-offs are in place, which endangers reliability and performance. And finally, they can gain traceability and auditability. For example, if a developer sends a new commit, and if it has to go through various gates with all the different types of policies enforced on all those gates, the developers can make sure that they don't introduce new defects or security issues within their commits. They don't have trade-offs, endangering reliability and performance, to putting the business at risk. And finally, they can gain traceability for their commit while it travels through their continuous delivery pipelines. And another thing to highlight here is that sometimes people talk guidelines while they talk about policies, and vice versa. But there is a big difference between guidelines and policies. Guidelines are suggested behavior. For example, when you pass the other side of the street, you look at your left, your right, and your left, and you pass if there is no car. But there is no one, assuming there is no police in place, there is no one that enforces you to look left and right. You can still pass the road. You may have, an accident, but you can pass the other side of the road. So that is a guideline. But when it comes to policies, they are actually enforced. They enforce expected behavior. And if the system doesn't demonstrate expected behavior, the policies could be enforced and blocking that certain thing to pass through that gate. And another thing to highlight here is that the policy and technology, because when, again, people talk about policies, the conversations tend to end up on specific technology selections, like this framework, policy framework, or that policy engine. But in essence, policies are defined by businesses. So they are the things that businesses define for their organizations. And technologies are the things that deal with the implementation. So you can have the coolest technology, but if you don't have policies defined, then that technology doesn't provide any value. Or you may have policies, but you have no way to enforce those within your software development process. And then you, again, don't get all the benefits from having policies. So these two things, policies and technology, must go hand in hand, and they should be enablers for each other. Now, we talked about what governance is, what velocity is, and what are the policies that could help ensuring governance is adhered within an organization. Let's look at sample continuous delivery pipeline. In this pipeline, you can see there are 3 teams. They each develop one microservice, and they follow the usual continuous delivery pipeline. They commit their code to source code management systems, and their code is gated in pre-merge, so they must pass static code analysis, unit test, build, and dependency scanning in order for that commit to be merged to their main branch. And once they pass those checks, pre-merge activities, and once they get approval from their peers as part of peer review process, that code ends up on main branch in their repository. And once the code is available in the main branch in the repository, it triggers a set of post-merge activities. And this could well be building container images, running some smoke tests, doing performance tests, and final security analysis. And again, this is yet another gate. And if the artifacts that are built as part of post-merge activities pass those gates, they end up on container image registry, for example. And from there, they are rolled out to production in different regions, such as Americas and EU. And the continuous pipeline doesn't end once the artifacts hit production. We have additional activities within production, such as canary development and A/B testing. And if you look at these things closely, they are all policies in a sense. Some of them are more explicit, such as security analysis, and others are the usual things we are doing, like static code analysis and unit test. But they are all there to enforce certain behavior and certain level of quality for any code contribution. And without meeting those expectations, your code or your artifact can't travel within the flow further. So let's pick a few of those checks in sample continuous delivery pipeline. And again, on the left hand, we have the same teams, team A, B, C, and on the right hand, we have the production, and in the bottom, we have developers. And if you look at the left hand side, you will see most of those things, or almost all of those things, are things developers are good. Developers are competent. They know what code they are contributing to. They know what kind of quality checks they must pass in order to get their code merged to main branch. So they are quite comfortable with that. Also, block list, for example, you may not want to use a certain dependency that doesn't really satisfy license requirements, for example. Developers, again, they are competent in handling those things. And if you take a step right, you hit post-merge activities. And again, these things such as privileges or pores, again, developers are good in these things and they can take all care of those things. But when you hit the production, then things become tricky, because in that case, the things are actually running live and there are different types of policies enforced there. For example, time-based policies, date-based policies, regulations. For day and time type of policies, maybe organization has a policy saying that no one is allowed to push any new change to production Friday afternoon because everyone is almost into their weekends and no one really wants things to stop working and dealing with troubleshooting. So organizations may employ policies that the new versions of their products are not permitted to go into production Friday afternoon. And date is another good example. The organizations may be running an online web shop and it is Thursday just before Black Friday, and the organization may have a policy saying that no one is allowed to push any new code or feature or change to production just before Black Friday, because Black Friday is the day of the year where most sales happen. So the organization may enforce policies and block any changes going to production. And this may be sometimes annoying for developers because they just developed a new feature, which is really cool, which may even help during tomorrow's Black Friday, but they are not permitted to do that. And that is kind of understandable because developers may not be, into business aspects or marketing aspects, and they may need to be guided when it comes to when their changes could end up in production. And the other example is regulations. Again, as a developer, you may have developed a great new feature and you want that feature to be available all around the world. But maybe as a developer, you are not very into different laws and regulations that govern these type of services all around the world. You may need to consult the legal department, or your change may be blocked from rolling out to EU, for example, because of GDPR, and your change may be possible to be rolled out to Americas because of different reasons. So again, in this case, the developers may have challenges when it comes to understanding what kind of regulations their business is operating. And all these things, quality type of checks or security checks or regulations, they are kind of, they belong to different domains. Like one set of these checks could look like they belong to development domain. The other type of regulation policies could look like they belong to a more marketing or legal domain. But in the end, everyone must be part of this entire continuous delivery pipeline or software flow from development to production, and they should be able to impact how these policies are developed, created, and enforced. And that can be achieved by policy-driven continuous delivery. Again, we have the same pipeline here, but this time, instead of individual developers dealing with, or teams of developers dealing with these policies, the policies could be developed, maintained, and enforced collaboratively. And policy framework helps in this case, because if everyone uses a certain policy framework with an organization, everyone can contribute. Obviously, some people may not be comfortable working with a specific framework, but at least they can make their opinions visible with type of such policy frameworks. And this also helps developers, because they can also consult others who are more competent in legal or marketing issues to create policies with help from them. And they can also, expand their knowledge when it comes to policies that are more related to businesses themselves. Okay, policy-driven continuous delivery helps organizations to enforce policies, but what about challenges? Obviously, like anything else, there are challenges with policy-driven continuous delivery as well. And on the one hand, some of those challenges are soft or more organizational-like challenges, and on the other, we have technology-specific challenges. On the organizational type of challenges, culture. Collaborative culture is important in order to be able to apply policy-driven continuous delivery. Because if the organization is not collaborating on such critical things, it is nearly impossible to achieve, covering broader scope of issues. Okay, developers may be looking after development type of issues, but if there is no contribution from other departments within the organization, it is very difficult to achieve full compliance to governance. The other thing is shared understanding. In some cases, yes, developers know why we have those checks within our pipelines, but in other cases, developers may not be aware of certain laws and regulations, and it is important that developers are taught about those things as well, so they gain some business understanding and see what they do and how what they do impacts the business. The terminology, it is important for us as humans to communicate with each other. It is important to have a terminology to achieve that. Best practice is another aspect. There are lots of organizations who successfully applied policy-driven continuous delivery, and organizations should look for best practice and build on top of those things rather than coming things from scratch. And open source is a great place for finding such best practices. Organizations must put focus on governance and policy-driven continuous delivery in order for this to be successful. When it comes to technology aspects, one of the issues within policy-driven continuous delivery is interoperability. There is no standard within continuous delivery domain, and interacting with policy frameworks is very difficult, because which continuous delivery technology you are going to use and which policy framework you are going to use, do they work with each other well? Are they integrated? And because of these questions, because of these challenges, interoperability is key. And this is one of the things we are working on addressing within Continuous Delivery Foundation. Adaptability is another critical challenge. It is important that technologies are adaptable based on the organization's needs. Policy development lifecycle is another important aspect. Like policy as code is something that different projects or organizations are actively working with. This could be adapted as well to ensure policy is developed and life cycle managed properly. And finally, third-party systems, like you have pipeline technologies, you have policy frameworks, and you may have third-party system that may need to interact with pipeline technologies and policy frameworks as well, bringing us back to interoperability and having some standards within the domain. So what are we doing to address these challenges? Conditional Foundation is a place which provides home for various continuous delivery technologies such as Jenkins, Spinnaker, Tecton, and so on. And it also provides home for various special interest groups, such as special interest group interoperability, special interest group best practices, special interest group events. As well as these special interest groups, it also provides home for end users. So you can come and talk about your use case and challenges and work with others within the community collaboratively. So Continuous Delivery Foundation is there to get these conversations happening, is there to enable cross-pollination and collaboration to address various challenges, and policy is one of them. So if we put projects, maintainers, organizations, and users together with the continuous delivery technologies, and if we bring contributions from policy type of projects, we can address these challenges together. And finally, policy is critical for all organizations, regardless of their size, industry, or type. Organizations need to define a standardized approach to defining and enforcing policies. Obviously, there are challenges in the ecosystem which we need to address, and this requires broader participation from various communities, projects, and end users. And Continuous Delivery Foundation provides such a place for having conversations, working on challenges in a collaborative manner, and coming up with solutions which could help everyone. So I suggest you to have a look at the links on the slides and browse through those links and join us in our working group or special interest group meetings. And now we have about 3 minutes for questions. Thank you very much for joining. Hi all, thanks a lot for joining. I hope you can hear me, see me. Any questions from anyone? I don't see any question on Q&A or chat part of the screen, but if you have a question, we can take that. We have about 2 minutes for a question. So while we wait for a question, maybe I can quickly ask a question myself, like what was the point of this talk? Maybe I think the policy topic is pretty critical for all types of organizations that are developing software and selling software-based services. And like many other things within open source communities, collaboration is key within organizations as well, because as I tried to summarize during my talk, the policies that could help organizations to enforce certain behavior or expected behavior and adhere to rules and regulations must be developed in a collaborative manner, because some of those policies require domain-specific knowledge, and in some cases, the developer community may not have the necessary experience or knowledge about such policies, such as business policies or laws and regulations. I think one of the ways to achieve velocity without sacrificing the governance or without neglecting rules, laws, and regulations is to enable ways to develop, maintain, and enforce policies in collaborative manner. And within Continuous Delivery Foundation, that is one of the things we have been talking about, how we can make things easier for organizations to adopt. How can we enable different types of teams within an organization to collaborate and contribute to policy enforcement within their organizations. So as I suggested, please check the links on the slide. Slides should be available on session link, and join our meetings where we are having these discussions. And I want to thank everyone for joining the session and see you next time. Have a great day, everyone, and have a great rest of CityCon.